Hello, hello, all those beautiful faces. Welcome to Teaching Liberty Live because to live free, we have to think free. And that is exactly what we do on this show. My name is Stephanie Edmonds, and tonight my guest is Spencer. What's going on, Spencer?
Not much. Just chilling out after day work.
Oh man, but things are about to get heated here because, there's some tension right now in the country, and there seems to be one of those powder kegs that we so often see throughout history down on our southern border that um, for better or for worse, may erupt into something more. As you can see, the title of this video is Are We Headed for a Civil War? And like, while in some ways maybe that seems sensational, or like I'm playing some games here with the algorithm, and hey, maybe I am, maybe I'm not. If in that, hit that like button. Make sure you hit that like button while we're talking about it. But no, seriously, secession, and I earlier I said succession. I was like, come on, man, it's secession. Anyways, yeah, just real quick, give us an overview of what's going on, down at the border. Like, is it hyperbole to say civil war question mark, or what's your quick take? Hot take.
Hot take. I'd say my hot take. If you know the economist Bob Murphy, he's one of my favorites. He's still living today, one of the modern ones. But he posted on his Twitter. He's like, before anybody considers this hyperbole, which you just mentioned, let's all agree that we don't want to kill anyone over this. So that would be my first initial impression. Um, Nobody needs to die here, and
Yeah, I'm totally with you on that one. My first thought is like, yes, like finally somebody's standing up to this. Like it's been going on for how long now? But then my second thought was like, oh no, is this a setup? I'm thinking January 6th or some of just these other kind of, in my opinion, psyops. So that's why I was like, we were thinking about what topic we were going to do, but when I saw this come up, I was like, okay, we have to talk about this tonight. You're a voluntarist libertarian, but also you are extremely well read in terms of history and states' rights and the Civil War and all that. So we're going to get into all that. But again, for everybody out there who is checking in live or checking in on the replay, make sure you hit that like button if you just happen upon this channel because I had a pretty catchy title and a good thumbnail. Make sure you hit that subscribe button. Welcome. This is Teaching Liberty. We get ready to open your mind, think free, and start living a more free life. Leave a comment, let us know in the chat how things are going. And also, I wanted to remind you that I have my class. We're speaking of these days where we're like seriously talking about civil war, which puts a threat on the economy, which, the food supply chain. So I'm putting on a class with my friend Elizabeth. And she's a farmer for almost 15 years now. Let's see if I can share my screen here. Boom. So if you go over to my website and you go to events, you'll see you can sign up for our class. It is a 4-week class about not just like how to grow your food at home, but just food security in general. You can't grow everything, but you can put together a good network, learn how to barter, see what other options are out there, and then just other regular sort of things that we take for granted. Like, where's your closest water supply that you could go tap into? Can you get around without Google Maps? Like, how far could you venture from your house safely and be able to get back without, a screen in front of your face? Just like basic things like that. We're gonna go give you and like she's super experienced and I'm less experienced. So we kind of bring both of those perspectives and meet people wherever they are in that journey. So head over to teachingliberty.org, check that out. And also make sure you follow Spencer. Go ahead, Spencer, plug your social.
Oh, sure. I'm on Twitter, or they call it X now. I'm Yates_Brutus. Brutus is the pen name for a couple of very contrarian and rule debunking
That's the one.
figures in history, notably Robert Yates during the American constitutional ratification, and as well as Brutus, who killed Caesar in the ancient Rome.
All right, there it is. So go check him out over on X at Yates_Brutus. I have that down in the description below as well. All right, without any further ado, let's go ahead and jump into this. And I might have spoken too soon without any further ado, because I don't know. I think that we, in this day and age, right, can you really seriously talk about a topic unless you start with some high quality memes?
I don't think so. That's
I
the
think it's a
best way
requirement.
to share context. Yep.
I think it's a requirement. So these are some good ones. I'm gonna give Spencer all the credit for curating these. He often curates my inbox with really top quality memes.
I did not
Dissident
make these
memes.
memes, to be clear.
Yes,
I
yes.
found them. Yeah.
So we have this one over here, right? What war are we gonna get into? You
Yep.
know? I think this one though is my favorite, right? Where Lady Liberty, which I have been known to dress up for us from time to time, is wondering if Texas is thinking about cheating on her, leaving her. So funny.
Yep.
We got a couple more here for you guys. All right, so we got, some good old Babylon B. I'm gonna guess like this has something to do with football. I'm not really there's a bunch of football going on, so I'm gonna guess Texas lost. That's probably what that means.
Yep.
Biden this is facing off in wheelchairs, but you're gonna have to explain this one to me. I'm not super up on all of, like, I feel like this is a pretty hardcore meme culture right here, so you're gonna have to explain this one. Like, the guy
The
with
one, yeah, the one on the left there is pretty old. I don't know if I even remember the original, but generally that's like a little stick figure animated guy, and he usually pokes at something that he wants something to do, like "Come on, do something" type of thing,
Oh,
and
okay, okay, let's go.
it usually just lays there and doesn't satisfy the stick figure. So
Ah, well all right, that sounds pretty much like my expectations for this situation as well, where it's like, okay, like there seems like to be some serious constitutional talk that's going on here. But like I said, I'm afraid that it's a setup that's just getting sucked back into this sort of like culture war, left versus right, like uni-party establishment. So I know you had sort of, had a way you wanted to navigate this discussion. And I think it was great to start with some context. So we're here, we're talking about some things. So I'm just gonna pull up the letter, right? So if you, unless you've been, I don't know, super, super far off grid, you're probably aware that our southern border is like Swiss cheese. And not just like Swiss cheese, it's like hand delivered on a gourmet plate Swiss cheese. Like there's a whole operation that has been set up. I mean, in my opinion, it's a manufactured crisis. I'm not sure from exactly what levels it's emanating or exactly, how orchestrated it is by who, but there's certainly a lot of money to be made and a lot of political gain you can see on either side, right? Because this can be a flashpoint for both sides for whatever, however they're going to spin it. So this is what Abbott had to say. Make sure it's on the right thing here.
yep. So Governor Abbott, he's from Texas, and he sent several letters to the Biden administration. The third one, I believe it's the third one. There might have been more. Went, I suppose, viral, if you want to call it viral. Spread around the internet because I guess it was populist in nature. Um, but yeah, essentially, um,
Yeah, I
Abbott.
think that's got it right there, right? The constitutional right to self-defense, and that's what perks our ears up too. We're like, "Oh yeah, yeah, like let's talk about it. Like we've been talking about it. Let's talk about it."
Yep, and he cites some constitutional articles. He says he declares an invasion. I think over a year ago, he sent the National Guard down there, and he's asking for more support to help the border. And then, of course, now there's some somewhat silly argument about whether they can put barbed wire in a particular river in a particular town. Yeah. And so,
Right, yeah. They've been going back and forth in the Supreme Court, right? There's a lawsuit going on. There was, like, a temporary stay that was put on Texas securing the border, essentially. But there was, like, supposedly some sort of loophole that didn't directly tell them that they couldn't continue putting up border protections, just that the federal government also had the right to, like, simultaneously take them down. So there's some, sort of funny business going on here, you can say, a little bit of political jockeying, and it's like, again, like, I want to assume the best intentions, right? I want to assume that Texas is standing up and doing the right thing, right? But I fear again that again it's just going to get sucked into this culture war like vacuum and turn into some sort of reason just to jail or imprison indefinitely or wildly over sentence Americans who are just trying to stand up for their country and their rights. So this was Biden's response. He says, "For too long, we know the border's been broken." Oh, have we, Joe? Please tell me more. That is why 2 months ago I instructed my team to begin negotiations with a bipartisan group of senators to seriously and finally address the border crisis. And, bipartisan, everybody's like, oh, I wish they would just work together. Listen, when they work together, you better like run and hide. So for weeks now, that's what they've done, right? They've been seriously and finally addressing the border crisis. They've been working around the clock through the holidays and over the weekends. Let's be clear. What's been negotiated would, if passed into law, be the toughest and fairest set of reforms to secure the border we've ever had in our country. You know, we could just follow the law as it is right now, but why we can't take more power if we do that, people, because listen, this law would give me as president a new emergency authority to shut down the border when it becomes overwhelmed, right? I mean, gosh, we don't want things to become overwhelming now. If
I
given that authority, I would use it the day I sign the bill into law, right? Okay, so then he talks about just like other stuff Congress needs to do with border agents and funding and stuff. You were gonna say something, I think.
Yeah, about all of this. Well, I think you and I will go into some of the nitty-gritty details here, but the you perfectly discussed it when you showed it there, the new emergency authority. Yep, that's what we definitely want to give the president. No backlash is ever going to happen from that.
But it's gonna
So,
be so fair. It's gonna be so fair and so tough,
yep.
right? They'll give you at least 1 meal a day in the gulag. Fair and
Hmm.
tough.
And as you may remember from, I believe it was Ron Paul said it a long time ago, but um, if you make border security too tight, it might not be for letting people in, it might be preventing from letting people out. If you think of like the Berlin Wall.
Right.
So, yeah.
I mean, there's a I guess they could like it's a lot of shoreline, to cover, but at the same time, obviously it would be the easiest, rather than escaping over the sea, there's a whole nother expense to like a boat and like how to survive on the sea. I mean, surviving in the jungle is probably no joke, but I don't know. I guess like I'm a sailor and as soon as people get onto boats, they're like so stupid.
Yep.
My own personal opinion. Um but, so, like, there is a little bit more history to this. Of course, the border crisis, it's been a thing for a while. I remember there was, like, the meme about, like, when kids were in cages along the border under Biden, like, "Oh, what kids in cages?" And then, like, as soon as Trump came in, it's like, "The kids in cages," right? And then when Biden came around, it was like, "What kids in cages? There's no kid," like, so there's been that. But there has been, like, a steady increase in well, I guess, like, during the pandemic, they were like, "Oh, health and safety, close the border," and they had this Title 42 thing, but since Title 42 ended last spring sometime, I remember, it's just been, like, record-breaking months, like, month after month after month for border crossings. What's some other
exactly.
context you wanna add in there?
Yeah, Title 42, like you mentioned, is actually a very old law that Trump enacted. It basically allows him to take more control over the border during like a public emergency or health crisis, and that's what Trump, I guess, assumed the wording to be because it wasn't exactly that he could just shut it down. But essentially, anyone applying for asylum, which is admittedly very subjective, anybody can say they need asylum. Um, then Trump would he it was a very high amount of deportations and just his general rhetoric caused people to not want to immigrate as often. And then as soon as Biden was elected, that changed, as you can tell from the chart.
Oh,
You
yeah,
just
yeah, I can
showed.
pull it back up.
Yeah. In 2021, right after Biden came into office, if you may remember this, it was not shown on the news too much because Vice President Harris did not do a very good job with it. But she was made in charge of the border. As you can see, that did not go so well. She did go down to Latin America and Mexico and try to talk to some countries. There was a good video snippet from that time that a lot of people have made funny memes and reels of, where she's talking on a podium on a stage and she just repeats, do not come, as like some sort of um, convincing of people not to come across the border.
I do remember
Yeah.
there was a video of, some guy who was coming up either near the border or whatever, but he was having an interview and they're like, "Oh, why'd you come?" And he specifically referenced the fact that, "Oh, well, now Joe Biden is in office," and so there was certainly it's hard to say, how people in other countries necessarily perceive it, but it seems to me pretty clear that people abroad perceived, like you said, Donald Trump's rhetoric of like don't come versus like they know the Democrats have been like weaponizing immigration, right? Have been sort of weaponizing it in a culture war way. Like, oh, we love immigrants. Like, come, like we're so diverse, we're so inclusive. Um but when they show up to Martha's Vineyard, where's all that inclusivity go?
Yep. So a number you just mentioned a good scenario. Florida and Texas. I think there's been some others too, but they've uh, sent out transported migrants to different selective, particularly blue cities, progressive cities, Martha's Vineyard, New York, Chicago, things like that. And it has caused a lot of churn there. I think they regret those decisions. From a more agnostic, libertarian angle here, I think it's a huge waste of taxpayer money to do that, but I do understand why they're doing it, and so it's yeah, you can take kind of a neutral stance here.
Right,
Um,
yeah, when it comes to these that's what I'm saying, it's always hard as a libertarian because and even as somebody who I would say, like, you don't even have to be a libertarian to feel this way, but maybe somebody who's just, like, a common sense person, right? Not an ideologue, is cool, with some amount of government and taxes and all that, but they are just I don't like that they're bussing them up, definitely a waste of money, but yeah, like, what are you supposed to do in these situations? It's like you have to take some action, right? And again, that's part of my it's like, I don't wanna be one of these people that's like, everything is a psyop or everything is just, part of the uni party's political game. Because like, I don't think that they can control everything, and, you don't want to not waste you don't want to, like, not use the political energy and try to bend it in your own way, but it's like, well, again, how much am I playing into what they want? So, yeah, that's again always what's going through my head in all of these things. But also, yeah, if you want to see a lot of this migrant stuff, I highly recommend going to check out Leroy Press. I'm trying to see he is often showing either the migrant shelters in New York City, or he'll even show where those buses that you were talking about um come right into New York City. So here's his page. I was gonna pull up something. Yeah, like right here is a bunch like right now it's super cold in New York City, and a lot of in and ending up just, like, on the street sleeping overnight. This is the Rose
Yep.
Boat Hotel.
And the fact that they're using taxpayer money to fund that is
Yes.
the frustrating part. Both
Ex
sides are doing this, so it's just a fight, and it's kinda ridiculous.
Right, like, I'm super pro-immigration. I was always way more pro-immigration than the US law allowed with all these visas and restrictions, and it seems like they made good people work really hard to, like, do it the right way. Um, but I w at the same time, if you're, like, literally paying people to come here, then it's also, like, an unnatural market in the other way, you know? Like, I'm for more open borders than we had, but I'm not for, like, I don't know, there was a really good video, like, Chris Martenson and who else went down to the border? Like, Chris Martenson from Peak Prosperity. I forget who else went. Maybe Joe Rogan went down there and did a really good thing, like, where they went around to the different camps to show, like, that there's, like, a whole system set up for these people to come up.
Mhm. Yeah, I definitely wanna get into the discussion of, uh, general immigration and policies that, libertarians like to follow with that. Um, did you wanna finish up the history of this particular incident real quick?
Yeah, well, what else yeah, like, go ahead. Whatever
Okay.
else you wanna say about the context here or bringing in some of the constitutional history. Yeah.
So in early 2021, that was when Texas called in the National Guard. They deemed it the Operation Lone Star, is what they called it. And so they started building barriers. I didn't get a timeline exactly on when the first barbed wire showed up, but I can assume it's been occurring for a long time. I think it's just this one scenario that's been heated in particular. Um, the current, I guess, conflict between Biden and Abbott is in the city around Eagle Pass. Apparently, there's a park that a lot of immigrants have been using to cross, and so Biden filed a lawsuit to make Texas stop using the barbed wire, and it's kind of gone back and forth since then. There's a lot of court cases, so I looked at a few. I can't really tell which one came first because there's multiple in parallel, but in October of last year, a U.S. district judge issued a restraining order on the federal forces saying you can't remove the barbed wire. And then in December, so 2 months later, the U.S. Court of Appeals supported Texas again because the Biden administration appealed it. And then in January, the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 on the side of the Biden administration, all the federal organizations saying, no, you can't do that. You have to allow federal involvement in removing the barbed wire. And then where it got really heated, where people started talking about civil war, is just this past week when John Kirby, National Security Council spokesman, on TV said that Biden has the authority to federalize the Texas National Guard troops to stop them, but Biden has not done that yet. And so that's where everyone started talking about, oh, is this is a big deal? They're gonna start having who the troops are gonna listen to type of thing.
Right. So, I guess, like, the every state has a national guard, right?
Mhm.
And national guard you're allowed to use for issues that happen domestically.
Yes, I mean I'm not an expert on National Guard, but yeah,
Okay.
there's a number of issues you can use National Guard for. It can be just like catastrophes, like environmental issues. It can be insurrections. It's basically like a militia that both the state and the feds can use almost whenever they need a lot of bodies to do something.
Right. Yeah, it would be
Yeah.
interesting to see, specifically, like, how the laws or whatever it is that governs, decides how that goes, like, who the direct authority is to, or if it is, like, equally saying that either the president or the governor can, call them up in an equal manner. 'Cause,
Mhm.
yeah, that would definitely be interesting. Now I feel like I saw Maryland and a few other states have enacted laws saying that they have authority, right? They have the ultimate authority over their National Guard, right?
Yep, there's this, movement called Defend the Guard, is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
that's what it's called, yeah. I
yep,
saw that.
it's getting a lot of traction. I don't believe anything has been signed into law yet, but there's several states, I think Maryland was one of them, Arizona, Texas, New Hampshire, Idaho, Wyoming, yeah, there's several states that have in their legislature, in one body, the legislature, either House or the Senate, they have passed or at least they voted in approval of like a defend the guard, where essentially um, there's more state rights over who can use the guard. In particular, the big um segment that they want to point out is that the federal government cannot use the National Guard to send to a foreign country unless Congress declared war,
Okay.
which we have not done since World War II.
Okay, got
So
you. So that actually might be more about the stuff that's going on in the Middle East,
it has a lot to
than
do with
even
that. Yeah.
about yeah, it's like, oh man, it's like we're fighting over people's borders in the Middle East. We're like maybe gonna, we're seems to be politically conveniently deciding to fight over the borders here. Um, I guess like you have this map too that how things are sort of really breaking down across the country, right? Because of course this is happening in Texas, and a lot of the stuff we've been talking about right now has been about what the state government of Texas has been going back and forth with the federal government, but sort of all there's an alignment that seems to be happening between the states that are saying, "Oh, we're with Texas," versus those sort of staying out of it.
Yep.
So, and you put this image in here. It says it's from the 26th. Is this the most updated one, or is there something that's
That's the
newer?
that's the most updated I could find.
Okay.
So there's a lot of both governors and national guards that have come out and either stated support or have provided support in the past to particular border situations. And so a lot of folks online are creating these, fancy maps about who's supporting who type of thing. And so as you can see on this map, the red states are the ones that are supporting Texas currently, either verbally or with troops. The green ones are the ones that have deployed their National Guard to their own border, but not to Texas. The purple ones are have National Guard uh, previously, but not currently. So since 2021, they have provided National Guard troops, but not currently. And then the striped states are the ones that have announced support but not sent personnel yet. And then the pink one, which I think is only New York, has troops deployed in Arizona but not in Texas. So anyway, there's quite a few states going around drawing these blue and red type of lines of who do we support.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's the one that I had put one sort of like on the front of this making it out to be a Republican Democrat thing, right? So, falling right into the trap that I said that I'm most wary of, but that's why I appreciate you coming on here and bringing this map that shows much more nuance. And I think that we should know this by now that the rhetoric that is often used is much different from what the facts on the ground are. And it really is on us because you're not gonna count on the media to do it, unless it happens to be, like, politically expedient that one moment in time, right? But consistently, you're not gonna count on them to do it, so you need to seek out this information, and again and especially, I tell you, it's when they point out the thing is when you must be the most skeptical. I always think of when they put on the bottle, they're like, "Made with real oil." I'm like, "Oh, yeah, great, made with real oil, awesome." You turn it over and it's like canola oil, like all these other ingredients, like the last ingredient is like a little bit of like olive oil or whatever. And so, yeah, when they're constantly putting out these things, oh, it's like, "Oh, the Republican states that are joining Texas, or, they're wanna secede and they're all extremists," whatever, it's not that there's not any truth to it, it's just that there's probably a lot missing from the story. And this is the details that are missing, is the facts on the ground. Where are the actual troops? How does the policy align with what people are saying or what narrative the media is spinning? So I love this. Thank you for that.
Mhm. Yep. There's a lot of support on both sides for border protection, and there's so much nuance and rules about immigration that it really causes a lot of problems. Do you want to cover how, like, the libertarian side of things, how you feel about just general and immigration?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I pretty much said my position about immigration in general. Like, I think that the government, as they do everything, they try to exercise too much power over regulation. Now, I do acknowledge that in our Constitution, it gives the government some regulatory power at both the state and the federal level, to protect our borders, to protect the sovereignty of the borders. So, um, again, when it comes to being that super principled libertarian versus making those on margin decisions, like, I think the nation state, international global order is not something I'm trying to change. In fact, that when people are trying to get rid of it and globalize, I'm like, no, 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 no. Like, the nation state thing isn't perfect, but fine. So I'm cool with the government exercising some authority over it, but I just think that too much. They do too much. And again, it's nice to see some people standing up, but I just get nervous when people give the government an excuse to be, um, to be like, oh, these people are treasonous or these people are, trespassing or whatever the trumped up charges are that they want to give them.
Hmm. Yeah,
So,
those are all really good points, and I agree. From from like the economic perspective, there's really not a great argument against immigration, so long as you're protecting property rights. The problem comes in political. There's a lot of political problems with immigration, and so uh, the Austrian economics likes to look at uh, the means to achieve an ends. So you have to figure out, like, what are the root causes of this mass immigration, or why would someone immigrate at all in the first place? And so if you look at the root causes, it's pretty easy to see some of them, and other ones you have to look at it indirectly. So the welfare state, us providing any sort of taxpayer funded benefits to anyone, causes people to want something for free if someone else is paying for it. Foreign interventions in other countries, whether it's like a sanction or actual troops or bombs, which the U.S. with our empire is definitely doing in just about everywhere, and we've done it for centuries.
yeah, when I was a
It's yeah,
teacher in New
since
York City, I started teaching in 2016. And, guess what the US started, doing a lot of around 2015, 2016? They were bombing the crap out of Yemen, right? Or, like, I guess
yep.
they were technically doing it through Saudi Arabia. But we in New York City, we had a huge influx of Yemenis immigrants. It's like, we hate them so much that we bomb them, and then we're like we're like, "Oh, they're coming to our country," like, "Oh," so yeah, it's certainly, I think that it's interesting that that's entering into the conversation though now, and the Republicans are using it as this weird talking point to be, I don't know, they're using it in ways that I don't approve of necessarily. Like, "Oh, we don't want those people over here. They don't have our values?" Like,
Yep,
they don't have your
exactly.
values, so you're bombing them. Like, what? What kind of
If
values are those?
if you create bad conditions elsewhere, people are going to want to move. So just like they move with their feet inside the states, when there's bad conditions in a particular city or a different state, they're going to want to move. So uh, that's just general for all humans, right? They want to leave the territories that are causing them pain and go somewhere else that they think has hope or potential to get a job, or places that won't bomb them.
Right,
So,
right.
yep,
Yep.
yep. So thinking of all those things, um, Yeah, like the principled stance on immigration is to first of all end all those things. You don't want to give out taxpayer funded welfare. You want to end foreign interventions, 100% free trade, no more sanctions. And so this is one of the big ones here. Borders are controlled by owners, right? And so when government owns land or water or air, whatever they happen to own, in this case, the barbed wire is on a particular river, the Rio Grande River. So if those were privately owned, then the owners could decide if that is trespassing or it's not trespassing.
Mm.
And in some cases, if traffic's high enough, maybe it would be more useful to convert it into a way that would be um, a way to make money off of it.
Rent
Maybe
a
they,
little rent seeking,
yep.
set up a
So,
little toll.
yep. So if they can prevent access to it with, and also guarantee people to be able to use it via um, whether it's a park or a road or a railway or whatever, some sort of transportation, or if they want to use it for even if they want to set up jobs on the river, who knows?
Yeah,
Private.
I do get a little, like, wary when we start talking about, like, rivers and, like, privatizing them and, like, access to rivers. I know the public system isn't better, but I'm not totally that's one of my main concerns about Venezuela. This is, like, sort of like a little, off topic from tonight, but, or Argentina, I'm sorry. Well, Venezuela too. Well, Argentina with Milei, right? How he's, deregulating a lot of these economies, and he's, like, selling it off to the private sector, but I I feel like, the market with all these huge hedge funds and BlackRock and what is it, State Street or Vanguard. I just feel like they are predatory, right? Like the biggest people in these markets are predatory because they're in bed with other governments and the Fed. So I get wary a little bit when I hear about, you know, or Argentina saying they're gonna, oh, we're gonna, or are you just selling your soul to BlackRock or Vanguard? That's my question. So anyways, a different topic for a different night where we can go into that was actually gonna be our topic, I feel like, originally before this came up was more directly about property rights and zoning and all of that, so we can cover that and how, like, the river thing would work out when we do our next podcast on that topic, but let's keep going with, the border stuff specifically, and anything else you wanna say about, like, the libertarian vision of that or wanna get more into the TEXIT movement specifically?
Yeah, just one more thing on immigration. Libertarians, they do admit that all of those like policies I just mentioned are not realistic in the short term. And so in the short term, before we can get rid of the welfare state and the foreign interventions and having only private borders, uh, libertarians want this thing called a sponsor system, where essentially only an immigrant can come across the border if they have a sponsor, whether it be a legal citizen or a business.
Okay,
So if a business wants to hire an immigrant, great. But now you're the immigrant sponsor, and if the immigrant does anything illegal, then the sponsor is also held liable. That's part of
mm,
the agreement there. So
interesting. I
it
feel like they do
yeah.
that with au pairs, right? Au
Yep,
pairs?
yep.
Yeah,
That's a good example of how a mostly private institution does it already. So yeah. So if you want to
okay.
bring in family members or whatever it happens to be, au pairs, or if there's whatever the organization wants to do, you just have to be held liable for if there's any issues with the immigrant. But that also stops a lot of the fights over welfare and who's going to take care of them, and a number of the issues about like asylum and all of those things.
Yeah, well, it just gives you a whole social network sort of built in, right? You're coming, you have a guaranteed place to stay that's not gonna cost you any money. You're probably even making money as part of the deal.
Hmm.
So yeah, my friend has an au pair, and she's really nice.
Nice. Yeah, so
Um,
that's pretty
yeah,
much
go
it.
ahead.
Do you wanna talk about TextIt? Have you heard
Yes,
of TextIt
there
before?
I have heard of Texit, but I can't talk about it in any more specificity than it's, like, sort of among the Blexit, and, what is the British one? Wasn't there, or was that
Brexit.
Brexit, yeah, there's all these, "Hey, we're leaving," right? It seems to me to be, it's talking about secession and, all their reasons why they can do it legally, and also, "Hey, if we did it, it actually wouldn't be that hard to." Yeah, I mean, Texas is the 2nd largest state right behind California, and I know California, they always say, "We're like the 6th largest economy in the world," so I can't imagine Texas is far behind them. They have a lot of oil there, so they have energy covered. They do a lot of farming, they have a lot of cattle and stuff, so I yeah, they seem pretty set up, and I that's gonna be my guess what TeXIT is. How close am I?
Yeah, pretty much they want to secede. And I think the biggest misconception about secession is that it requires a war, and it most certainly does not. So peaceful secession is what they're talking about. Um, but it's the movement started specifically in Texas in 2009. It's not only a Republican dominated movement. Um, California had a movement in 2016 after Trump was elected, and they're on both sides. So you can't just say it's Texas alone or Republicans alone. They've collected over 130,000 signatures to be placed on a ballot measure for this
Oh,
2024
wow.
for 2024 primary elections in Texas. However, after a number of disagreements about signatures and rules, Republican leaders are currently denying some of the signatures, and so now it's gone up to the Texas Supreme Court, and I don't think they've made anything official yet, but so far they've denied to make a ruling on it. So,
And so it's interesting
yeah,
because it's Republicans, right? So everybody's like, "Oh, it's but it's almost like some infighting because I mean, these are people who are in the government. They believe in the government system. They would lose power if Texas seceded in many ways, They may or may not have a job ahead of them, and so I love that. It reminds me, so I don't love that, but it's just so it makes it again, it shows that this narrative of Republican versus Democrat, of, left versus right is just so manufactured from I remember the opening school stuff. It was like, if you believe Trump, you're an anti-science MAGA grandma killer, right? And if you trust Fauci, you follow the science and you're a good person. Right? But then if, you go to a place like New York City and it's like everybody's a freaking progressive Democrat, Not everybody, but, like, mostly, and then it's like, but also wait, they're also having the same problems in Florida, which is supposed to be a red state, right? So, again, it just goes to prove that a lot of this narrative stuff is just purely narrative, and if you actually take, a few seconds or whatever, we're gonna be on here for an hour or so to hear another perspective or care to even just ask some questions, you're gonna very quickly see that it falls apart. I'm definitely curious to see where this, ballot initiative goes because that is kind of a big deal.
yep. Other states have tried it before. I would like to see it. So all the surveys out right now are just regular independent agencies trying to collect surveys, which have a lot huge leeway and accuracy because obviously you can't get everyone. So yeah, it would be interesting to see. And secession is peaceful secession. To clarify
Well,
that is
yeah, I wanna
very
talk
important.
about that. I wanna talk about that, because we can say peaceful secession. It's one thing to be like, "We're peacefully seceding, bye," like, "We're totally peaceful," and then, like, back up and then like, "Okay, everything's good," and then, like, turn around and boom, like, you get shot. When you so that's my thing is, like, you can say you're peacefully seceding, but the person who's, like, losing control over the territory might have different ideas. And that it does make me think about the Civil War. I mean, we can't have this discussion without talking about the Civil War and, what that was about. Was it, just about slavery, states' rights? What are the different parallels that can be drawn? But certainly one parallel, if I'm recalling my history right, like, please correct me if I'm wrong, is that the South is seceded, right? The South was like, peace, like we're out, like we're gonna do our own thing economically, and we can go into, the reasons, how much it was just economics in general and how much slavery is part of that economic pressure and like the tariffs and stuff. And I'm pretty sure it was Lincoln. Well, I guess technically the southern states did fire the first shots, right? But wasn't Lincoln was didn't like the Lincoln and the North, they had a military base that was technically in the South, and like they kept like resupplying it, right? So it was almost like they were provoking the South by continuing to supply their this one particular military base, which I can't recall the name of. And it basically provoked the South into being like, oh my God, they're going to attack us. So we need to preemptively attack them. And that was sort of like the first, but that was they seceded before Lincoln took office. And then once Lincoln took office, he took escalating actions to basically, start a civil war and try to bring them in. I don't know if you want to fill in my history and then talk about how that might apply to what's going on here.
Yes, definitely. So the Civil War was not the first um, time in America, and it's obviously happened globally a lot too, where secession is either threatened or occurred. Um, and just so to make it completely kosher or proper that secession can happen without war, since World War II, the number of countries in the world has almost tripled, right? So after the Soviet Union collapsed, I think we had 12 more countries um, become their own sovereign states. Uh, a number of the highest GDP per capita countries in the world right now: Luxembourg, Monaco, Singapore, Taiwan. All of these countries have seceded and they were peaceful, right? So um, it's it's important to
When did
realize that
Luxembourg when was that a thing? When did Luxembourg who did they cede from and when was that?
I wrote it
I'm
down.
testing your history here because 'cause I'm just thinking because I remember wasn't Luxembourg one of the like, they got the Nazis invaded them, and that was, like, one of the triggers for the US or not I'm not Britain and all these other countries, like, getting into the war. The US wasn't in yet.
Yeah, so a lot of these countries at some point in like the Middle Ages were their own because back in the Middle Ages, whether people realize it or not, Europe was like thousands of countries.
Right, it was
It
like
was
the
not,
whole
yeah.
loosely the Holy Roman Empire, but, like, really I mean, Germany didn't
Oh,
form
yeah.
until, like, 1870, right? That's when, like, Germany was unified and the Holy Roman Empire finally dissolved. Okay, so it
Yep.
is that is interesting, a really fair point, something that I hadn't thought of. I guess, like, I think a lot of, like, okay, there was a lot of countries created in the Middle East, there was a lot of countries created in Africa, but, I wouldn't necessarily call those bloodless or created, like, without
Yeah, some of them do happen with
coercion of
violence.
colonialism and things like that.
Yeah, some of
So
them
that
do
was more
happen with
like
violence. So I'm just reiterating the point that it does not have to be with war. But yeah, with the Civil War, you are correct. Fort Sumter was the primary one. There was another fort that was farther south that I can't remember the name of right now. But that was in much later. But what happened after President Lincoln had the election in November, South Carolina was the first to secede in December, while President Buchanan was still in office before Lincoln. And they actually went to both Buchanan and Lincoln. South Carolina sent representatives up and said, "Hey, we want to negotiate with you. Uh, let's divide up who owns what territory we can go into, what our economic conditions are going to be, how are we going to trade." They did this peacefully. They didn't come to D.C. with weapons and said, "We're going to kill you." No, they came up there and tried to negotiate. But Buchanan said, "I don't have the authority to do that." And then Lincoln, after him, said, "No, go away." And so the forts, there were two federal forts. One of them, Fort Sumter, was the big one in Charleston, South Carolina. And basically, Buchanan and Lincoln initially agreed that they would not provide any resupplements to those forts.
Right.
And then Lincoln eventually disobeyed that. But South Carolina also made the mistake of firing on Fort Sumter without Fort Sumter firing on South Carolina. So it's a kind of a bait and switch false flag trap there. You know, Lincoln got his excuse to go to war because he got fired on, but he was also violating some sort of promise, whether it was a real promise or a fake promise of not resupplying the federal forts, and they wouldn't negotiate with them. So I can't say either side was in the right here, but I do support peaceful secession. I don't support fighting on it. But yeah,
I thought
there's
you
yeah.
have a really good slide here on some other early views of, like, secession, nullification, and its role in our republic. This is one I certainly, oh, this isn't the Thomas Jefferson one I was thinking of. I'm thinking the one where he's like, "If the people don't get rowdy every once in a while, like, let their government
Oh,
know they're out there, then, what kind of republic is that?" But this is a good one too. In 1816, he said, "If any state in the Union will declare that it prefers separation to a continuance in union, I have no hesitation in saying, 'Let us separate.'" Right? John Quincy Adams, "If the day should ever come, may heaven avert it, when affections of these people, of these states shall be alienated from each other, far better will it be for the people of the disunited states to part in friendship from each other than to be held together by constraint." A little bit earlier than that, we have James Madison for the Virginia Resolution in response to the Alien and Sedition Act, which again, it's another interesting thing. Like I think, we think so fondly upon those first years of the nation, but literally our second president was like, "Oh, sorry, you can't say what you want. Alien and Sedition Act. Like, we're gonna come
yep,
jail you. Weaponize the government against my, political enemy over here, Thomas Jefferson." It wasn't Madison that did that, though. It was, Quincy Adams' father, John Adams. Um
yep,
Alright, so yes, he argued they were unconstitutional because they violated the First Amendment. States have the right to declare federal laws unconstitutional within their borders. And I love this. This is something I say all the time to, local people, like school board members. I feel like school board members like, "Oh, but the state, but the state, but the state." I'm like, "No. Like, you have the local authority to say, 'Cool, great, idea. We're not doing it here.'" Right? Like, that's what a federalism is about that energy being exchanged both from the top down, which I think we're very accustomed to these days, right? The federal government asserting its power on the states or the states asserting their power on the local, but we're not so used to pushing it the other way. And I think that we need to get back to that. Thomas Jefferson saying Kentucky Resolution in response to the Alien Sedition went further than Madison in asserting that states could nullify federal laws deemed unconstitutional and that this was a remedy to prevent the abuse of power of the federal government. Again, it's like if the federal government can't make a law that states agree to follow, like,
yep.
boo-hoo, right?
Nullify. Hmm.
Yeah. So shout out to our founders, our founding generation, I should say. Uh,
Yep, and I have on the next slide several more instances of both talking of secession, threatening of secession, and nullification. So this is common in the U.S. history. This is absolutely common. Louisiana Purchase, which is not written in the Constitution that a president can buy property from other countries. Um, New England talked about secession for that during President Jefferson's Embargo Act of 1807 because of the Napoleonic Wars. New England again raised the process for secession. In 1814, New England again was talking about secession. They didn't like the War of 1812, and they didn't like the way that they were paying for it. Vermont and New York. No, Vermont. Actually, this is one of my favorite parts about like the American Revolution. Vermont actually was not its own state. New York and New Hampshire both thought that Vermont territory was part of their territory. And they said no. So they went off. They actually created their first constitution on the North American continent in 1777, and it was pretty revolutionary. It prohibited slavery and gave all adult males, not just property owners, which was the common way to vote then, the privilege to vote. And it wasn't recognized as a state until 14 years later. Nonetheless, they existed. They govern themselves, which is pretty awesome. And then the nullification crisis of 1832. I'm pretty sure everyone knows about something called like the Tariff of Abominations. That was from 1828. And so President Jackson, who was a big tyrant in many ways, he signed a force bill, and he was going to use military force to get the southern states, particularly South Carolina, to pay this tariff. But eventually they reduced tensions by pulling back some of the tariffs.
Oh, look at that. Funny how that works,
Yep.
you know? So, this is, again, good to get a little history. I feel like Americans in particular have, like, a very short history. Um, I also just, like, when I think about the way that people in that have I guess, like, their countries have longer histories, I would say. And I don't know, I think of Islam a lot, right? And the way that they speak like even if they're not super religious, they speak like with this very like religious sort of I don't know, like thing entwined in their language. And I feel like they have a lot of like more historical references to like understand their current situation and stuff, just like a longer historical memory. I mean, Americans obviously have a shorter history, but it just seems like maybe it has something to do with the way that we view ourselves too. Like, you can come here, you can be anybody, you can do anything, you can remake yourself, right? Um, it almost seems like we're like, it's like you want to make a legacy, but it's like seems disconnected from your family in a way, even though the most powerful Americans are always have these crazy family dynasties. Anyways, just some thoughts there. Just, um, but let's see, what else do we got going on? I guess you have even more examples here of just like constitution and secession. I mean, yeah, the 10th Amendment is a big one. This is one that can be referred to in so many instances, right? Any power that is not in the Constitution is given to the states, right?
Yep.
Um, and so a lot of these like regulations and all this and stuff, it's not it's not actually a law. It's not actually a law. Um, the states have their own power on those things. And yeah,
Yeah, I
just
list a
more
bunch of
examples.
stuff here that when you start talking about laws and constitution too much, people eyes start to glaze over. So, but yeah, happy to go into detail here if you want. But essentially, secession, reading the Constitution as written and not interpreted, is perfectly feasible. But of course, the Supreme Court case right after the Civil War, which a majority of the justices were placed on the court by Lincoln, rejected the idea that the states secede. So we do have Supreme Court precedent that secession is not legal according to the Constitution, even though the Constitution does not say that. So,
I mean, doesn't the Constitution, I guess it's not in the Constitution, it's in the Declaration of Independence, which I mean, in many ways is part and parcel with the Constitution. I mean, you can't really have the Constitution without the Declaration of Independence, and the Declaration of Independence, I mean, the first thing it does is declare its right to separate when you become unhappy with the situation. Um, so, I mean, technically, right, the Americans were like, "We wanna secede peacefully, like, here's a piece of paper that says that," but they knew war was coming, and that's what I fear too, is, like, it's one thing to say that we have peaceful intent, um, but I in no way believe for a second that the federal government in particular, but we can even see many factions within the state government itself would ever let it go down that way. Um, and that's why it's like, I just feel like if people just said, we're just not participating in that anymore, right? Like, we're just doing our own thing here. We're gonna, um I don't know. I just like I don't want to I feel like it would be in not in our favor to have a hot war, like I feel like they want
Definitely
that. That's what they want. They want an excuse to crack down with the might of the military and of the legal system to lock people up and to put things in martial law and
control, ration, nationalize
right.
all the industries. Yep,
Like,
exactly.
it's a great excuse, so that's why it's like, on the one hand, I'm like, "Yes, people are standing up and fighting back," but on the other hand, I'm like, maybe there's a better way to fight back, and it's by, buying a few chickens and planting some stuff and learning
Yep,
how to barter with your neighbors. Um so, we
exactly.
went over a lot of the different secession movements. I mean, there are so many. You literally have 2 more slides of them domestically and around the world. But, I guess, we're coming up on an hour here. So, why don't we talk a little bit more, I think, about the Civil War, right? Because I think that this is a prescient debate. There was like a whole thing. Joe Biden made a statement being like, slavery was the cause of the Civil War, right? And then there was this whole thing going on for several days, at least on Twitter, people going back and forth fighting about the causes of the Civil War. Was it slavery? Was it states' rights? Was it I don't know, all these other reasons. So why don't we do a little segment on that and then we'll wrap up with like what your prediction on what you think might be coming in the next days or the next week, like where do you think things are realistically going to go from here, not, idealistically based on our like, oh, we're peacefully but like being practical. But first let's talk more about the Civil War. I know in school certainly we teach that slavery was a main cause of the Civil War. You can read the lists that the states put out, right? They say they list off the reasons, and I think in almost all of them, if not all of them, they list slavery among one of the top reasons that they leave. But there's other ones, right? So
Yep.
so talk a little bit more about this and fill in some of that historical context. Enlighten those of us who haven't studied this since 10th grade.
Yeah. So the corporate state media, like you mentioned, likes to say that the Civil War was all about slavery and nothing else, or if it was something else, it was so small it doesn't matter.
Why
And
do you
our
think they do that? Like, what would be the point? Like, what does that achieve? Is it just because we're in this, like, really, like, cultural moment where race matters and, like, slavery's bad and American history has to, like, be totally framed around slavery? Like
I think it goes back to two things. One of them is the oppressor oppressed type narrative where you have to see that the government is there to be the one to get rid of the oppression. And then the second part is the growth of the government during the Civil War and after the Civil War was such a huge flip of what it was prior to that, that they have to state why that expansion of government was a good thing.
right,
Com-
and that's sort
yeah,
of the same thing that they end up doing too, like, for the civil rights movement. They're like, "Oh, because the government was systematically enforcing, discrimination, now we have to give the government the power to not to undo all of that." And I can see the same way you're saying, "Okay, well, government was enforcing slavery legally, but we have to pretend that government is actually more a force of good, so they're the ones who ended slavery, like, yay. Okay, got it."
yep.
But the real
Um,
story is
so the real story is slavery was definitely a part. Whether you could say it was the number one part or not, I don't know. I don't think it would be considered number one. I think one of the best questions you can ask yourself is, would the Civil War have happened if slavery did not exist? And I think it still would have existed. The Civil War, probably. Well, let me clarify. The secession still would have happened. I'm not sure about the Civil War because that was pretty much all on Lincoln and his administration deciding to go to war. But secession, I believe, still would have happened. And I think probably the biggest way to look at it from like one context is if you go to that tariff slide, and it really expresses just how much of a difference there was between the South and the North at the time. The North was heavily industrialized, the South was almost all agrarian agriculture, right? That's the
Yeah, that's
source.
the wrong thing, I have it on the wrong.
Um, but they fought over these consequences of those cultures since the beginning of our country, really. So the South, because they were agrarian and had a highly export driven economy, they wanted zero tariffs. It was very important to them to keep up their way of life with zero tariffs. And it was the exact opposite for the North. The North wanted high tariffs because they had a lot of industries that were competing, and they wanted the South to buy their industrial goods.
Right,
And
and they
so,
didn't wanna have to compete with, like, overseas people selling the same goods. They wanted them to have to pay extra to sell in the US. Got it.
yep,
Yeah, that was sort of what I was thinking too, because it's like, okay, whether or not you have, free labor or not, like, whether or not you're using enslaved forced labor or not, you still have an agrarian economy, right? Like, your margin is not gonna be nearly as wide, but the same overall sort of, economic factors are gonna be in play with, like, okay, I have the raw materials and you have the finished goods. We have some interests that align, right? But then we have when you look at the larger scale of things, like it's not just us here domestically, there's international factors to consider, which then creates some things that cause us not to align perfectly. So yeah,
yep,
I think that I can buy that argument. I think that's more or less my perspective. But certainly when you have like you said, you're not sure if like, well, maybe if there wasn't this factor of like forced labor, and I mean there's lots of economic implications, but now you have this whole social system that's also built up around this like ethically horrible, way to be setting up your life.
yep,
So yeah, you have a lot of stake, right? There's a lot of stake both economically and socially that wouldn't be there if you didn't have this forced labor component. Uh,
yep. And important notes on that is both the North and South and the West. None of the white or non-colored people liked blacks at the time. No, there was very, very few that wanted them integrated into society. And Lincoln's plan, as well as many of the abolitionists, was to actually send the blacks to outside of the U.S. somewhere, either give them their own colony or send them back to Africa or bring them to Cuba or Latin America. They just wanted them out. They didn't even want them to integrate. And so that's very sad. It wasn't just the South that hated blacks. It was both. It was all sides, unfortunately.
yeah, I mean, there was
Yeah.
slavery. A lot of people again like think about, well, it was the southern states and they were the slave states, but the North, except for perhaps Vermont, they all had slavery. In when the Civil War was being fought, there were slaves in New York City. There's a
Yep.
really great book called Chains. It's more of like a young it's like for kids in middle school. I would say like late elementary school, middle school. You could read it in high school as well. But even as an adult, it's like a historical fiction book, but it's about little slave girls from Rhode Island, but they end up in New York City, and it's set in the time of the Revolutionary era. So it's really showing that contrast between like America's fight for freedom, or like these white men's fight for freedom versus, these little black slave girls that were in New York City. So again, another factor to think about when people are just trying to get you to buy like, oh, North versus South. Oh, it was over slavery. Like, how could it only be about slavery if the North had slaves too?
Yep.
Right?
There were 4 states and several smaller cities, like I mentioned. that still had legal slavery there. Yep.
Yeah, in the book, they talk about the difference between the North and the South when it came to slavery, and he was like, "The North has the respectability not to, like, sell slaves in public. It has to be, like, a private deal brokered between 2 men, and, like, you do it, whatever, but open air markets for enslaved peoples,
Yep.
'cause, the North is respectable with their slavery."
Definitely. Another economic condition that was very influential was basically along goes along with tariffs, but also just what the government's allowed to do essentially. So uh, Lincoln was a big supporter of Henry Clay's American system, which is what he deemed it. He was a Speaker of the House for like almost 2 decades, I think, and he had this like whole system that he deemed the American system in like a speech one time, and then it just kind of took off from there. But essentially, it's like the modern state what we have today. It was commerce regulations between all the states. It was central banking. They didn't have central banking back then.
Is
Um,
this right here, the list of things right here?
no, 28, slide 28. It was federal government funded transportation, utilities, parks, public works, internal improvements. They essentially just wanted like a modern state control, federal control over everything, and that conflict between states' rights or federal supremacy was constantly in battle. It happened even while the supposed like President Jackson, as we talked about, um, was in power. He was from the South, so it really just didn't matter who was in power. The federal government still wanted to take over more sovereignty, and that was the thing that a lot of the states in the South just didn't agree with. Yeah.
So, Honest Abe was a psyop, so you're telling me?
um,
Honest Abe in the top hat, from where is he from? Arkansas? A country boy from Arkansas?
oh, he's from Illinois. He's from Illinois.
Illinois?
Yep.
Okay, like, whatever. One of those Midwestern places. I'm here in New England. You guys are all just, like, additions. Trying to keep track of you. Um,
And
but
Lincoln even mentioned he has several quotes saying that he would have fought the Civil War regardless of slavery. During his inauguration speech, he mentioned he has no intentions of placing any rules on slavery, but he was going to protect the Union. That was always his thing. He didn't believe in secession. So
man, you wanna think that these people who have been built up as, like, heroes, as protectors of, the American system, the American system, but it's at least not as simple as that. I guess I definitely would like to do a second look at Lincoln and try to really figure out what his deal is because he seems like he's like a super complicated guy. He used to follow there was like whoever that politician was before him, I forget what his name is that he ended up beating out. Um Forgetting his name, but this guy was, like, super popular, and he used to follow Lincoln would follow this politician around, and, like, after he would give his speech, Lincoln would give his speech and be like, "Hey, come here and listen to what I have to say." So it's just so interesting, and I always also just wonder, like, what motivates people to, like, want that amount of power and that amount of control over these things? Like, are they sociopaths? Is that or is it a money thing? Like, did he get incredibly wealthy by doing this? Like a lot of the politicians today seem to be, if not motivated by wealth, like they stay in the game for those inside trade deals, right? Um, and just I also think about, the Fed okay, this they had a nationalized banking system, like, what are the bankers doing? Like, how does this fit into the global scene at the time? What's going on over in Europe? How are we still connected to those banks, and what kind of implications do those have on why yeah. Anyways, asking
yeah,
lots of questions, that's good, it's always good
the
to ask questions.
there's a good book on that, The Real Lincoln by Thomas D. Lorenzo.
Okay.
Yep, he's definitely really good source on that. But yeah, he's not the all-knowing saint that the media and our public schools like to paint him as. Um, and many of the abolitionists at the time actually wanted the South to leave. They were like, "Fine, leave, please. You're discrediting our great country in the North here. Please
Right,
just let
right.
them go." Yeah.
Yeah, because certainly, like, plantation slavery was way worse than being, like, a city slave. I know, that if you read Frederick Douglass's book, he talks about that sort of being his good fortune was that he got sent from the country where he was born when he was about 5 years old, and he went to Baltimore. And so he just had food, like, he didn't have to want for food, and he wasn't sleeping in a barn with no clothes, so he was, like, warm, he had food, but then also he that's where he was able to, like, learn how to read. But I do, think like also it should be said, obviously, like slavery, no matter whether you're in the country or in the city, is not good, right?
Yep.
It's bad in so many ways. It's bad morally, ethically, socially, and not the least economically. I know there's certainly certain people that would have a better, margin, be making a better margin, um, but overall for the economy, forced labor is not a good thing. And we sort of covered this a little bit in our last video where we talked about zoning and how it's basically if you choose discrimination, like you're walling yourself off from so many opportunities. Um, there might be a limited sense in where it works for, like, I guess maintaining a certain look of a wealthy neighborhood, and it might have a certain allure from the outside, but, in the long term, they're gonna be missing out on things. So, I guess let's just talk about before we end here and go into what is, like, practically gonna be happening next in this situation, how you see it playing out. Like, in what ways just does slavery is slavery not good economically in particular?
Yep. So slavery, in all cases of it's like forced labor, right? That's what we're talking about when you talk about slavery. That's like the highest definition of getting rid of property rights and bodily autonomy. You have full control over someone. You can sell them like property. You control their labor. And so any use of force causes negative externalities. Not only so it can benefit the person that's get the use of the force. So if government gets to use force, sure it might benefit them and their cronies, but it hurts everything else, right? That's a negative sum game. A positive sum game is when there's voluntary action. People are both sides, or if there's multiple parties, all willing to agree on a resolution that benefits both of them. That's like the most important part of voluntary action. It's mutually beneficial. Otherwise, they wouldn't do it. And so that kind of goes into the economics here. Is uh, it's slave use is negatively correlated with economic development. You can look at all sides of it. They've done studies on it. They've come up with different numbers about specifically how much it hurts. The ones that I saw, the GDP back then it was called GNP. The GDP in slavery states was about half of what it could be if slavery did not exist. And just directly, about 20% of their GDP was related to slavery. So not only just the ownership of slaves, but selling them in between and the enforcement of it and all of that.
Right, yeah, I mean,
Um,
it probably wastes, like, a good deal of resources that you waste on just, like, controlling that workforce instead of doing, like, research and development, and then it's sort of just like government, how it puts a buffer between you and whatever the cost is of something, right? Whether it be poverty or, seeing homeless people in your community or your street is messed up, right? Well, the government takes care of that. Well, it's sort of the same thing, when it comes to whatever industry you're in, right? If you have a wheat field, but you're not working your own wheat field or you're not, directly involved in that work and, you just have a bunch of enslaved forced labor that has no or very little incentive to be like, "Oh, hey, look how we can better, take this wheat or this cotton in or this tobacco in," right? So yeah, I can see how a lot of the incentive that is there for somebody who is choosing to be there, who's making money from it, who's getting some sort of benefit is like, hey, how can we make this better? How can we do this more efficiently? How can we make more money? And you just take away so many of those economic factors when your workforce is forced.
Yep. Humans are motivated by their incentives, so all those motives are important. They essentially, when if you think of it, if you put yourself into a slave's shoes, their objective is to not get hurt, to not get punished, right? To make it to the end of the day, whatever satisfies them, whether it's sleeping in their bed or being with their families or just having leisure time, right? So they have no incentive to try to improve their working conditions or try to make it more productive. They just want to stop getting punished, essentially, and it allows for great inefficiencies all across the spectrum. Yep.
And here's some good books that are on that specific topic. I haven't read these ones, but they come
Yep.
recommended
The one
by
on the right
Spencer.
is a journal article, but yeah.
Okay. I also recommend Frederick Douglass's My Life, My Bondage. He has 3 different autobiographies, but the one I'm referring to is his first one. It's his most concise one. I recommend reading them all, but he really covers all of these topics, not necessarily in a direct like economist sort of way, but in a much more analysis of how sociology and psychology works, and just like obviously the, he experienced it, right? It was his firsthand experience, and he does not spare any details. It's definitely a book that you should read with a box of tissues next to you. Um, because and I just think it's so important too, like, I know a lot of times that American schools get, accused of whitewashing history, and I think that's true in many ways, but I think that it should be required reading. If we're gonna go if we're gonna use the force of the government, I'm gonna use the force of the government to force you to read, Frederick Douglass's autobiography. I don't know, that might defeat the purpose though. All right, so, I think that we did a really good job here in terms of covering the current event, going back in and building up some historical context, reaching back to the Civil War, to our founding, bringing in, of course, the libertarian perspective, because that's sort of your worldview. And I guess practically speaking though, right? If you were putting on your punditry hat and you were sitting on NBC or Fox and you were gonna give, you know, not a total establishment neocon or neoliberal answer or whatever, but like, a politically practical answer that's like within the play here. Because I know you say you want it to be peaceful and voluntary, but I don't know if that's necessarily the most practical way. And I think I'm talking a little bit more short term. I certainly think there'd be much more build up to actual like, you know, like fighting. But yeah, what should we expect, in the next month, 2 months? How do you see this playing out?
I don't foresee violence between Texas or federal government, um, and I certainly hope that doesn't occur. I think both sides will use it as their populist message of if you elect me, then I will fix it. I think that's going to be the biggest narrative, whether it's Trump or Abbott or whoever's coming up in the next elections, Biden. They're going to say, "Hey, if you elect me, then I'm going to fix this situation," and neither of them will fix it because, as we
All right,
mentioned
what about
earlier,
this emergency order that Biden was floating, like with the new emergency powers he wants to grant himself? Is that going to be a thing that he does, or was that just a little bit of rhetoric?
Mm.
Flexing like I could.
Uh, I don't think the House is gonna vote for that unless, unless Trump is in, which
Right.
and
Well,
they
he
still
can
have the
do it through
majority. but
Okay, I guess right, he was asking Congress to do it. He was like, "Hey, Congress, do
yeah.
this thing." So he wouldn't do an executive order?
Oh, an executive order. That would be tough. I suppose it's possible. I think I think both sides would agree to allow the president to get more authority here to do something if they think it's going to stop the immigration. I'm not going to say it's actually going to stop, but if they think it will stop the immigration.
Right.
So yeah, I'm not quite sure how it'll play out. I just I don't think there's going to be a conflict between the states. The only way that I think a peaceful secession could happen is if a predominantly Democrat state secedes. I think that's the only way it would be peaceful because I feel like the Republicans would be like, great, we don't want you here anyway. But if it was vice versa, I think the progressives or the Democrats would use force to try to keep them in.
Mm,
Unfortunately, so.
interesting. I guess my advice would be, you know, defend your home, but your home, unless you live in Texas, your home is not Texas, you know? Um, and so that's I do get a little worried when I see, like, these, like, groups being like, "Oh, we're gonna go and we're gonna help Texas," you know? Because in one way, it's like, yeah, this is our country, but at the same time, I feel like that starts getting a little bit questionable in terms of, like, property rights and who's and even state sovereignty, and it really does risk taking something that could hopefully just be maintained to a small border dispute that involves some state rights and federal government, as we've seen throughout history, and making it into something bigger, which again, I think that puts the upper hand to the governmental powers. Whereas I just think that if you know, defend your home, your property, like your town, you know, do what you need to do in terms of that, especially when it comes to um, potential people coming over who are desperate, who were promised a certain American dream but don't have an American dream, and now it's like, you know, they're coming for the taking. Like, definitely. Um, but I think that the best defense is being able to, and even the best offense is just making sure that you have all your bases covered in terms of food, education for your kids, just everything that the government provides you, this nice lifestyle now, make sure you have a backup, right? That faucet that you can flip on, make sure you know where you can go if that faucet doesn't flip on with nice clean water anymore, right? Where is there a source, and they are all over the place, like just spigots coming out of the mountainside where you can put a thing and get nice fresh water, right? Same thing with your roots. Like, you need to know multiple different ways to get to sort of, you know, people who you know are you're cool with, right? So you need to be able to get to these places. You need to have, you know, basic food that if you get stuck in your house, like, can you sustain for 2, 3 months and not have to go to the store and, you know, it's the middle of the winter, so you're not growing anything, or, like, you're not growing, you know, tons of stuff, or at least it's gonna take you a second to get your, like, greenhouse up and running and growing things to sustain yourself. So these are all sorts of things that I think that people can be doing that are much more effective in terms of actually being prepared and not getting sucked into that political narrative, which is so it just seems to be so powerful, right? Like, that difference between what are the actual facts on the ground and what are these people saying? It's like they can literally say anything and it seems to carry so much weight and, like, shape people's reality, but it doesn't match reality at all. Um, so that's my thing. You know, I'll give one more plug for my class that I'm teaching with my friend Elizabeth. We're going to be going over all these things, give you like a nice structured way to go about them, learn some new things, a little community. You can get that over at my website, which is teachingliberty.org. I have it linked in the description down below. You can go back to the beginning of the stream. I showed you how to do it. And yeah, make sure already if you haven't hit that like button, hit that like button, leave a comment down below, let us know what you think. Fact check us, tell us why we're wrong, tell us why we were right, tell us how beautiful we are. What else you got for the people to before we get out of here, Spencer? Anything? Any last words?
Thanks for joining. I had a lot of fun discussing this. It's good to go back and look at, past books and history that you may have read either 10 years ago or a few years ago. So it's fun to think about. So thank you.
Yes, and make sure you're following him over on X, aka Twitter. I have that down in the description below. It's Yates_Brutus. Make sure you're following me on all the different platforms. Make sure you share this out with your friends and be like, yo, this is where it's at. Maybe not like that. Like however you would say it, just say it like that. But definitely hit that share button. I know you're in a bunch of group chats. Share it with your group and let them know that we're out here thinking free, living free, and giving all the glory to God. So until next time, next Monday, same time, same place.